Hey, you got the captain, Captain Fuzzy here, and I've seen a lot of questions on the message boards, Source Filmmaker message boards, especially from new people, asking about how they could improve their posters and how they could improve their lighting. And the most common answer to those questions is 3-point lighting. And usually the reply to that is, well, how do I do 3-point lighting? And the reply to that is usually, look it up. Well, that is good advice, because there are different takes on how 3-point lighting should be done, but in general, there's a couple of simple rules about 3-point lighting that are the same across any of the websites that come up. So I just did a simple Google search for 3-point lighting, and this was one of the first pages that popped up. This one's one of the top pages. I like this one in particular because it doesn't get too technical. It basically explains the setup and usage of 3-point lighting, and it does even touch on 4-point lighting here a little bit. But it's explained in a very simple and easy to understand way, and they even give you kind of a guide to go by here with the positioning of the lighting. Will leave one thing out in this image that I see on some of the other web pages, and that's the camera position in relation to the lights, which really the camera position can change just depending on your own personal tastes. But generally, as a general rule, the camera is usually positioned right in this area someplace. And the lighting is positioned like this as well on the other pages. So basically what I've done was use that web page as a guide to show you what 3-point lighting looks like in Source Filmmaker. First of all, you got to notice that 1, I'm in the clip editor, and 2, I am in the camera 1 view. This is where you need to be when you are doing any kind of lighting, because this is what it's going to look like when it's rendered. Because if you render it correctly from camera 1 or whatever camera you're using, this is what it's going to look like. And now most scene building, positioning of the model and stuff like that is done with the work camera. As you can see, when I switch to the work camera, the light looks a lot brighter than it does in the regular camera. And there's a reason for that, because the regular camera is your render camera, so it's more detailed. There's settings for it to adjust depth of field, field of view, shadows, all of that sort of thing. You know, you have all of these adjustments in here: bloom scale, tone map scale, aperture, or the amount of blurriness in the background. All of these are adjustable from the camera view, and there's a reason that you can't do that from the work camera, is because the work camera is not intended to be your render. It's intended to just use to position things, and that's it. So whenever you're doing lighting, you always want to be in either the clip editor or the motion editor, particularly the motion editor if you intend to move the lights around any. Then you'll need to be in the motion editor to move them, or the graph editor, but I'm not going to worry about that right now. But either one of these, you can be in either one of these and move the camera around, and move the lights around. So, but in order to get an idea of exactly what it looks like, you need to be in the regular camera view like this. That's one of the key things, because if you adjust your lighting in the work camera view, it's going to be a lot dimmer when you switch back to here, as you can see. And that can make or break your poster right there, just not having the light set properly. The best way to do this is to spawn 3 lights and set them up, and in this case I've renamed them, which is easy. You just right click and click on rename animation set, and you can rename the light whatever you want. Well, in order for me to keep track of which light's which, I've of course named them key light, fill light, backlight. That way I can keep up with where everything is and what it's doing. The key light and fill light are actually kind of interchangeable depending on what you are doing and the kind of look that you want to get. Because these are both out front and off to each side of the subject. So these actually do the main lighting. The key light actually does the biggest majority of the lighting, and you can tell that simply by just simply turning it off. And now, as you can see, all I have right now is the fill light and the backlight. The fill light is really only for softening shadows and things of that nature, because if you remove the fill light, then you have these sharp contrasting shadows in here. Now if that's the look you're going for, well then by all means don't use a fill light, and this is what you'll get. But if you're going to go and use full 3-point lighting, then when you turn that on, it softens these shadows out. You still have some contrast here, but not nearly as much. And the reason for that is because these two lights are set at different intensities. The key light being the main brightest light, I normally leave at default. And then my fill light, I normally drop much lower, but I still leave enough intensity on it that it softens the shadows on this side. The backlight can pretty much be adjusted any way you want it. If you want it to define the outline of the shape a little bit more of the subject, then by all means just raise the intensity, and that's exactly what it'll do. It will highlight the outline of the shape of your subject a lot more and more or less make it stand out. But it's usually recommended that its brightness is somewhere between the key light and the fill light for a nice balanced look. But again, this is all subjective, so experiment with the intensities and look for what best suits you and what best suits the image that you're going for and the atmosphere that you're going for. That's the key thing. Another important thing to remember is light color, light composition, color composition. When you are placing your lights, you want the lights to highlight the subject in a fashion that makes it look like the natural light that's coming from the map or the scene build that you're doing. And that is all dependent entirely on the type of scene that you're creating. So there's no real set rule for that, except that try not to use contrasting colors. Try to use colors that accent one another and that fit the theme of the image that you're trying to create. If you're trying to create an image where it's a nighttime scene and there's a campfire and a full moon out, well, you have to imagine what are the colors involved. Well, fire normally gives off an orangish, yellowish kind of a light, and moonlight is normally a whitish color with a hint of blue to it. So then you would go in and adjust your light colors to accent that. So the key light would be the light coming off of the fire. So in this example, we could say that the fire is in this area, the campfire. So you want your key light to be the same color as your fire. So what we need to do is drop the blue and try to get a little bit of a yellowish or orangish color into it. Drop the blue and the green just a little bit to get kind of a yellowish orange color. Something along those lines right in there, probably. Something about like that. And that would be a good color for like the campfire. And then you want the moonlight to also be reflected in this. So you could then use the fill light and drag the green and the red down and give it a bit more of a bluish tint. Not too much. You don't want them to contrast. You want them to accent one another. And then maybe even do a little bit of the bluish on the backlight or rim light. And I'd set it roughly about the same as the other one, and then you get a nice sort of firelight effect with it, with a little hint of the blue from the moon, the bluish light from the moon. And I'm just going to hit Control Z and put that all back. Put the colors all back. And there we go. But that's the idea with color composition. You don't want to mix severely contrasting colors. You don't want to mix greens and reds. I mean, they just don't mix very well. Blues, greens, and purples mix pretty good. Reds, yellows, and oranges mix pretty good. But those two sets don't really mix well together. So you don't want to combine. And blue and green, they get along pretty good together. But you don't want to get too terribly. In other words, look at it this way. If it does not look good in this view, then it doesn't look good. So don't change it. And like I said, lighting is so subjective that you have to have an image in your mind of what you want your image to look like in order to set your light best. Now, light positioning, I basically, like I said before, I have the light positioned where they normally should be for a 3-point lighting setup. The lights can be moved closer in, further back. I would not advise moving the lights themselves unless you've already adjusted the intensities and they're just not quite cutting it. Then you can move the lights closer, maybe move them a little further back. But you should put the lights roughly equidistant of your subject, which basically means that they should all be approximately the same distance away from the subject, and then you just adjust the intensity to bring out the highlights and accent the details in the model that way. But if you do have to move the lights, one little nice tip I can give you is grab one, click on it, hold it, drag it onto the viewport. Now, your viewport now becomes your light, and you can move that around any way you want. And I personally find this a lot better and a lot easier because of the simple fact is wherever this viewport is pointing is where the light's pointing. And it gives me a much more accurate control over positioning the lights and everything like that. And it's a neat little thing to know how to do because it's a lot easier than turning the light frustrum on and off all the time, and because sometimes you'll forget to turn it off and then you'll render your image out and be like, hey, what's these white lines? Oh, I forgot to turn my light frustrum off. Well, now you got to go in and redo it. And if it's one that took like an hour to render, maybe you have a potato of a computer or something like that, and it took a couple of hours to render it out. Well, now you got to start all over again because you got these light bars in there because you forgot to turn the frustrum off. So the easiest way is don't use the light frustrum to begin with. Just do that. click and drag on one of your lights. Click on one of the lights that you want to move and hold it, drag it onto the viewport, and then the viewport becomes the light, and you can position it real quick, real easy. You can move it up, down, put it however you want it, and it just makes life in Source Filmmaker a lot easier when you know all these little shortcuts. So, good little tidbit of information right there. Now, one of the things that they point out in this, especially with this portrait here, is they point out wattages. The key light's a 300 watt and the back light's 150 watt. They don't really say what the fill light is, but they say it's being used from a bounce board. Well, in Source Filmmaker you don't have a bounce board, so the way you simulate that, any of these, is by using your intensity slider here. And this is how you adjust that. A bounce board, basically what it does is provides, it's a reflective surface that the light bounces off of and then onto the subject. And if you've ever paid any attention whenever you've went to a photo studio for like a family photo, or it's picture day at school, and you'll sometimes see the photographers will have this one or two of these whiteboards or reflective silverish looking boards set up with a light shining directly at the board, and then the board's pointed towards where you're going to sit for your picture. Those are bounce boards. That's what those are. It's a way of creating a soft light with much softer shadows than what you would get if the light was pointing directly at the subject instead of bouncing off the bounce board. So that's what a bounce board is. It's just designed to create more even and softer shadows and even lighting. It's all about shadow control is what it is. But that can be achieved with these settings in Source Filmmaker, a similar effect, and even by turning some of the lights on and off. As an example, I can turn off the fill light, and that will create sharper, more contrasted shadows on the figure here. And if that's a particular style you're going for, then this is the setup that you want to use. You basically can either turn off the fill light by clicking on the eye here, or you can just not use a fill light. Because like I said, the 3-point lighting system is very flexible, and it's really the only limit is your imagination and what you want to see. That's really the only limit to it. I can also, if I don't want it brightly illuminated, then I can also do away with the key light, and then I have more of the backlight or rim light and fill light affecting the subject rather, and then you end up with a somewhat more subdued. There's still contrast there. There's still the light here along the edges from the rim light, and there is some subdued lighting from the fill light, because as I said, the key light should be your brightest light, then the fill and backlight should kind of both be, well, both should be lower than the key light, but the intensity on these can vary depending on the effect that you're going for. But that's how you can get different effects out of it. All three on, and then of course if you turn all three off, then you just got this standard flat looking model there, and that's the whole point of the lighting, is making it stand out from the back, making it stand out from the background. Now, this article does make mention of 4-point lighting, and really the only difference between 3 and 4-point lighting obviously is a fourth light, but that's the background light. Normally that's used to illuminate something in the background back here that you kind of want to show up or want to draw attention to, but it's not the main subject the of the artwork. So in this case, I could put like a panel back here or something and have a light shining on that panel and highlighting something on that panel, like, well, I don't know, it could be anything. It's just whatever your imagination can come up with. But, if there is something in the background that you want to draw the viewer's attention to, then that's when you would use a backlight. Otherwise, this is all you really need. Now, on that subject, I've also noticed some people complaining about Source's quote-unquote 8 light limit. And I think there's a little bit of confusion on this. Source Filmmaker does not have an 8 light limit. It has an 8 shadowed light limit, which means you can only have a maximum of 8 lights that create shadows. And when it comes to 3-point lighting, shadows are what make 3-point lighting work the way that it does. So you never want to turn the shadows of your 3-point lights off, because if you turn them off, then you're not going to get the same effect. However, in the course of scene building, you may have other lights in the map back here in the background illuminating this, that, or the other thing. Your background light, you may have a background light in here in the case of 4-point lighting. Those lights don't necessarily have to produce shadows. They just have to produce light. And you have to think your way through how you're setting up your scene in order to get the best out of it. But as a general rule, if you place a light that does not need to cast a shadow, simply right-click and disable the shadows. And what that will do is, just as you see here, it disables the shadows. Now that light's no longer creating a shadow. I still get the effect of the light. I still have the rim light here. It's still highlighting the outline of the model, but there's no shadows. And you can kind of see a difference in there, because now if I put it back, enable the shadows, now you can see somewhat of a difference in there. Now the shadow, of course, is now on the ground. So that's why you don't disable shadows on your character lighting. You only disable them on like the background lighting, and then that's only on lights that you don't want to cast shadows. And that way you can really, hey, you can use just about as many lights as your computer and Source Filmmaker can handle at that point. I've had some maps where I've only had 4 lights in them, and I've done some images and stuff where I've had upwards of 30 or 40 lights in them. But of course, not all of those lights casted shadows. They were there for accents, to highlight something in the background or bring something out in the background, have it stand out, or just for ambience reasons. But yeah, you should never exceed 8 shadowed lights in Source Filmmaker. And if you're going to start disabling shadows, never disable any of these shadows for your 3-point lighting. Never disable those, because the shadows are what allow you to get the effect that you want. The last thing that's important in light composition on Source Filmmaker is your light colors. The colors can be adjusted in the sliders under the light that you've got highlighted down here. The more you drag each color to the left, the more you take that color out of the scene. Or the lower you make it, basically, is what it amounts to. The colors should accent the overall scene. And what I mean by that is, if you place your character, as an example, in a scene build or a map that has like a campfire in it, and you want the light from the full moon at night to contrast with the light from the campfire, then the best way to do that is adjust your light colors to reflect that. And one good way of doing it, using our imagination, we could say he's standing at a campsite in the woods. It's a moonlit night, full moon's out, campfire's right over here, so that's going to be our key light. So what we're going to do is move the key light and adjust its color to reflect the campfire. So what we're going to do is basically drag the blue out and bring in some yellow to yellowish, orangish. So you're going to want to drop the blue a little bit, and then maybe drop the green just a little bit to highlight a little bit of an orangish yellow right there, like so. Now that's your fill light, or your key light rather. That's the light coming from the campfire. So then our fill light, he's on the other side. This is your shadowed side. So we want that to reflect the moonlight a little bit. So then what we're going to do is do the same thing with the green and the blue, or the green and the red that we did with the blue on the other one, and drop this down and give that light a little bit more of a bluish tint to simulate the moonlight hitting him, like so. And then you can probably, it doesn't hurt to do the same thing with the backlight. Of course, depending on the position it's in, put these in about the same position that you did for the fill light, and it will basically give you the campfire effect with the moonlight. And it's kind of hard to see there, but see, if you switch to the work camera, it really looks like crap. But in here, it doesn't look half bad. Now, in a dark setting, the blue would stand out a little bit more. Plus, you can adjust intensities to enhance that a little bit, but your lighting scheme would end up looking something like this. And while it's not, like I said, it's the wrong kind of setting, but I'm basically just using it as an example. But then you would adjust your lighting here, like my fill light as an example. I could pull that over here where my fill light is over here, move it just this way a little bit, and maybe just a little bit closer, like so. And it pretty much gives you that same effect. Intensity is one thing you can also do to highlight it just a little bit, and it would be pretty reasonable right there for a nighttime moonlit campfire type scene. The lighting would be something similar to that right there. Don't mix contrasting colors together, or don't mix colors that have nothing to do with the map together. Don't make a blue themed map and then throw pinks and purples all over it, because the purples might mix okay, but the pinks not so much. It just doesn't sit well is what I'm getting at. You can have contrasts in color, but try to keep the color scheme consistent with the overall scene. Everybody has favorite colors. My two favorite colors are mainly blue and green. However, you may have red or whatever might be your favorite color. Just because it's your favorite doesn't mean it belongs in every scene. Okay? Make the colors match the scene, or you're going to have somebody inevitably is going to tell you, fix those damn lights. It will happen. I've seen it. So basically, this is all there really is to 3-point lighting and lighting in general. Most of what I've learned and most of what other people have learned is mainly just been through trial and error, experimentation. You fiddle with it a little bit, and you find what works for you. You kind of develop your own lighting style, sort of, after a while. But always be flexible with it, because what looks good in one fashion may not, or in one scene or map, may not look as good in the next one. So this is just, like I said, this is just the basics to get you started. Then you have to experiment and adapt as you do different projects on there. But as a general rule, don't clash your colors with your background, with your theme of your map. Don't clash with it. Adjust the lighting so that you can make your model or subject look as good as it can possibly look, and use 3-point lighting as a basis to begin with it. And really, it's not that difficult after that. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to contact me on the Steam message boards. I hang around the Source Filmmaker boards rather frequently. I can also be contacted with a message or comment on my YouTube channel, and the link for that is also on my profile, my Steam profile. And I can also be contacted on my Steam profile as well with any questions or comments. So please feel free to ask away. I'll do my best to answer your questions as quickly and as accurately as I possibly can. In the meantime, this is the Captain, Captain Fuzzy, and I am out of here.